The sound of $50 changing hands in Judge Carter's office would change 2 lives forever. Kate Sullivan stood barefoot on the wooden floor, her 15-year-old frame barely casting a shadow in the dim Colorado sunlight streaming through dusty windows. The man across from her had kind eyes, but weathered hands that spoke of loss. Tom Mitchell wasn't buying a worker that day in 1892. He was unknowingly rescuing the daughter he never thought he'd have, while she was about to discover that sometimes the most broken people create the strongest families. What happened next made an entire mountain community believe in second chances again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Judge Carter called my name, I thought it meant another beating. Mrs. Hayes, the mill overseer, had dragged me from my station at the spinning machines without explanation, her fingers leaving purple marks on my arm where she gripped too tight. I'd been working at Hillside Textile Mill for 3 years, ever since the fever took Mama and Papa when I was 12. The state said I was lucky someone would take me on, even if the work was 16 hours a day and the pay barely covered my sleeping space in the mill dormitory. My hands were already ruined by then, scarred from the machinery and stained permanent, brown from the dyes. The other girls said I was cursed because accidents followed me, threads breaking when I touched them, looms jamming when I walked past. Mrs. Hayes called me clumsy and docked my wages every time something went wrong. I'd learned to move like a ghost through the mill, trying to make myself small enough that trouble couldn't find me. But trouble found me anyway that Tuesday morning in October. Mrs. Hayes marched me through the streets of Millbrook like I was being led to the gallows, her heavy boots echoing off the wooden sidewalks while mine made no sound at all. I clutched my mother's Bible against my chest, the only thing I owned besides the brown dress on my back and the thin shawl Mama had knitted before she got sick. The courthouse was bigger than I remembered, all dark wood and serious faces staring down from painted portraits on the walls. Judge Carter sat behind his enormous desk like a king on a throne, his white beard neatly trimmed and his eyes sharp, behind wire spectacles. Next to him stood a man I'd never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying temples and hands that looked like they'd seen honest work. "This is the Sullivan girl," Mrs. Hayes announced, pushing me forward into the center of the room. "She owes the mill $47 in housing and medical fees. Can't pay it, naturally. Been nothing but trouble since she arrived." I wanted to speak up, to tell them that the medical fees were for when the spinning machine caught my sleeve and nearly tore my arm off, and that I'd never asked for their charity. But I'd learned long ago that speaking only made things worse for girls like me. So I stood silent, counting the floorboards beneath my feet and trying not to shake. The man beside the judge stepped forward then, and I noticed he moved carefully, like someone who understood what it meant to be afraid. When I dared glance up at his face, I saw something I hadn't expected. Concern. Not pity, which I'd grown tired of, but genuine worry about what might happen to me. "Tom Mitchell," he said, extending his hand to Judge Carter rather than to me. "I understand there's a situation here that needs resolving." Judge Carter nodded, gravely. "The girl has outstanding debts to the mill, and Mrs. Hayes is within her rights to have her sent to the state workhouse. Debtor's prison, essentially. She'll never work off what she owes there." He looked at me over his spectacles, and I saw something that might have been regret in his expression. "Unless someone is willing to assume her debt in exchange for a labor contract." That's when Tom Mitchell looked directly at me for the first time, and I felt something shift inside my chest. His eyes were the color of summer earth, brown and warm and steady. He didn't look at me like I was damaged goods or a burden to be shuffled around. He looked at me like I was a person who mattered. What kind of work would be expected? He asked Judge Carter, though his gaze never left my face. General domestic duties, ranch work, whatever needs doing. Mrs. Hayes interrupted. She's strong enough, even if she's not bright. Been feeding and clothing her for 3 years, so she knows how to follow orders. I bit my tongue to keep from correcting her. I could read and write better than most of the mill girls, thanks to Mama's teaching. And I knew how to cook and clean and mend clothes because I'd been taking care of myself since I was smaller than a fence post. But defending myself would only prove her point about being troublesome. Tom Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was trying to read something written there in a language only he understood. Finally, he turned back to the judge. How much? $50 would cover her debts and the contract transfer, Judge Carter replied. It's a legal arrangement, Mr. Mitchell. She'd be bound to work for you until she turns 18, or until the debt is considered paid through labor. After that, she'd be free to make her own choices. I held my breath while Tom Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He counted out the bills slowly, his hands steady, despite what I could see was nearly everything he had. When he placed the money on Judge Carter's desk, I felt the strangest sensation, like a door that had been locked my whole life was finally swinging open. There's something you should know, Tom said quietly, still looking at me instead of the men conducting the business of my life. I'm not buying you, Miss Sullivan. I'm offering you a place to work and live where no one will hurt you. The choice to stay or go will always be yours, whatever the papers say. Mrs. Hayes snorted. Don't fill her head with nonsense, Mitchell. She's a mill girl, not a princess. Hard work and discipline are what she needs. But Tom Mitchell didn't seem to hear her. He was still watching my face, and I realized he was waiting for something from me, not obedience or gratitude, but some sign that I understood what he was offering. I nodded once, just barely, and saw his shoulders relax slightly. The legal proceedings took another hour, with papers signed and witnessed and stamped with official seals. I stood through all of it like a statue, still clutching Mama's Bible and trying to understand that my life had just changed completely. When it was over, Tom Mitchell turned to me and spoke the first words he'd addressed directly to me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Are you ready to go home, Kate? No one had called me by my first name in 3 years. At the mill, I was just Sullivan, or you there, or that clumsy girl. Hearing my name in his gentle voice made something crack open inside my chest, and I had to swallow hard to keep from crying right there in the courthouse. Yes, sir, I managed to whisper. He picked up my small bundle of belongings, just a spare dress and my mother's sewing kit wrapped in a threadbare towel, and walked toward the door. I followed him outside into the crisp October air, my bare feet silent on the courthouse steps. His wagon was waiting at the hitching post, pulled by 2 patient brown horses who looked as kind as their owner. Tom helped me up onto the wagon seat, with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout the morning, making sure I was settled before climbing up beside me. As we drove away from the courthouse, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Hayes watching from the window, her face twisted with disapproval. I turned my back on her and faced forward toward whatever was coming next. The ride to Tom's ranch took us through the most beautiful country I'd ever seen. The mill had been surrounded by gray buildings and smoking chimneys, but here, the world opened up into rolling hills covered with golden grass and stands of aspen trees turning bright yellow in the autumn light. Mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Tom didn't try to fill the silence with chatter, which I appreciated. I'd grown unused to conversation that wasn't shouted orders or cruel comments. Instead, he pointed out landmarks as we passed them. The creek where the water ran cleanest, the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring, the ridge where eagles nested. His voice was quiet and steady, like he was sharing secrets with an old friend. When we finally turned up a dirt road marked by a simple wooden sign reading Mitchell Ranch, I felt my breath catch. The house was nothing like the grand mansions I'd imagined rich people lived in, but it was the most welcoming place I'd ever seen. Built of local stone and timber, it sat nestled against a hillside like it had grown there naturally. A wide porch, wrapped around the front, and flower beds that had once been carefully tended, showed signs of neglect but not abandonment. Tom brought the wagon to a stop near the front steps and climbed down, then came around to help me. My legs were shaky from the long ride and the overwhelming changes of the day, but I managed to stand on my own. "This is home," he said simply, shouldering my bundle and walking toward the house. The word hit me like a physical blow. Home. I hadn't had a home since Mama and Papa died. The mill dormitory was just a place to sleep between shifts, cold and crowded and smelling of machine oil and other people's sorrow. But this place, with its solid walls and patient horses, and the way Tom said the word like it meant something precious, this felt like it might actually be home. Inside, the house was dim and dusty, but spacious and well-built. Tom led me through rooms filled with heavy wooden furniture and windows that looked out on the mountains. Everything was clean but unused, like a museum of someone else's life. I noticed there were no photographs on the mantelpiece, no personal touches that might have belonged to a woman. "You'll have your own room," Tom said, stopping at the foot of a staircase. "It's small, but it has a good window and space for your things." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "I should tell you, Kate, I've been alone here for 3 years. I'm not sure I remember how to share a house with someone else." I looked up at him, this man who had paid $50 to save me from the workhouse without knowing anything about me, except that I needed saving. He was worried about making me comfortable when I'd been sleeping on a straw mattress in a room with 8 other girls for the past 3 years. "I don't take up much space, Mr. Mitchell," I said quietly, "and I'm used to staying out of the way." Something sad flickered across his face. "You don't need to stay out of the way here, Kate. This is your home now, too." He showed me upstairs to a small bedroom with whitewashed walls and a real window that looked out over the valley. There was a bed with an actual mattress, a small dresser and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. Compared to the mill dormitory, it was like a palace. "Supper's usually around 6, Tom said from the doorway. "Nothing fancy, but there's always enough. Tomorrow I'll show you around the ranch, introduce you to the animals. For tonight, just rest and get your bearings." After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to understand what had happened to me. That morning I'd been Kate Sullivan, mill girl with scarred hands and no future. Now I was Kate Sullivan, ranch girl with her own room and a man who spoke to her like she mattered. It was too much to believe, too good to trust. I unpacked my few belongings, placing Mama's Bible on the small table beside the bed, and hanging my spare dress in the tiny closet. Then I sat at the window and watched the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold I'd never seen from the mill windows. That night at supper, Tom and I sat at opposite ends of a table built for a family, eating beef stew and fresh bread in comfortable silence. The food was simple but more flavorful than anything I'd tasted in years. When I complimented his cooking, he smiled for the first time since I'd met him. "My wife taught me," he said quietly. "She said a man should know how to feed himself and anyone who depends on him." I wanted to ask about his wife, about why he was alone in this big house, about why he'd saved a strange girl from the mill. But something in his voice told me those were stories for another day. Instead, I helped him clear the dishes and wash them in the kitchen sink, working beside him like we'd done it 100 times before. When it was time for bed, Tom wished me good night at the bottom of the stairs like a father might, and I climbed up to my room feeling safer than I had since Mama and Papa died. I knelt beside the bed and said my prayers for the first time in months, thanking God for Tom Mitchell and whatever miracle had brought us together. As I drifted off to sleep in my own bed in my own room, I heard the sound of Tom's footsteps. On the porch below, walking back and forth like he was keeping watch, it occurred to me that maybe he was as scared as I was, in his own way. Maybe we were both broken people trying to figure out how to be a family. I pulled Mama's quilt up to my chin and closed my eyes, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling into night. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly and the wind whispered through the aspen trees. For the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep without fear. The rooster's crow pulled me from sleep before dawn, but I didn't mind. At the mill, we'd been awakened by the harsh clang of the factory bell, a sound that always made my heart race with dread. This was different, a natural call to morning that seemed to invite rather than command. I dressed quickly in my brown work dress and crept downstairs, expecting to find Tom already gone to his chores. Instead, I found him in the kitchen, standing over the stove with his back to me. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and yellow lamplight made the room feel warm and safe. When he heard my footsteps, he turned with a slight smile. "Morning, Kate. Sleep well?" I nodded, still not quite believing that someone cared enough to ask. "Yes, sir. Better than I have in years." He gestured toward the table where he'd set 2 plates. "Sit and eat. We've got a full day ahead of us." The breakfast was more food than I usually ate in 2 days at the mill. Eggs, bacon, fresh biscuits with honey, and milk so rich it left a line on the glass. I tried to eat slowly, the way Mama had taught me, but hunger made it difficult. Tom didn't comment on my appetite, just refilled my plate when it emptied and poured me another glass of milk. "Tell me about the mill," he said quietly, cutting into his eggs. "What was your work there?" Most people who asked about the mill wanted to hear how grateful I should be for the opportunity, or how character-building the hard work had been. But Tom's question held genuine curiosity, like he actually wanted to understand my life before this moment. "I worked the spinning machines mostly," I said, showing him my scarred hands. 12 hours a day, sometimes 16 if they had big orders. We weren't supposed to talk during work, and the noise was so loud you couldn't anyway. I got good at reading the machines. You could tell when thread was about to break by the sound the spindle made. Tom studied my hands with the same serious attention he might give to injured livestock. "These are working hands," he said finally. "They tell a story of someone who doesn't give up." His words made something flutter in my chest, a feeling I couldn't name. At the mill, my hands were evidence of my clumsiness, my inability to keep pace with the other girls. But Tom saw them as proof of perseverance. After breakfast, he led me outside into the crisp morning air. The ranch looked different in daylight, bigger, more alive. Chickens pecked around the yard, and I could see cattle grazing in distant pastures. A barn cat sunned herself on a fence post, and somewhere nearby, a horse whinnied softly. "This is Frank Rodriguez," Tom said, introducing me to a weathered man emerging from the barn. "He's been helping me keep this place running since my wife died. Frank, this is Kate Sullivan." Frank tipped his hat politely, but I caught the question in his eyes. He was wondering what a skinny mill girl was doing on a cattle ranch and whether I'd be more help or hindrance. I'd seen that look before and knew I'd have to prove myself with actions rather than words. "Morning, Miss Kate," Frank said kindly. "Tom tells me you're going to be lending a hand around here." "Yes, sir. I'll do whatever needs doing." Frank's expression softened slightly. "Well, there's plenty that needs doing. Tom's been trying to manage this place alone for too long." Tom showed me around the ranch with the patience of a good teacher. He explained how the cattle rotated between pastures, pointed out which fences needed mending, and introduced me to each of the horses by name. There was Molly, a gentle mare with kind eyes, and Buck, a sturdy gelding who did most of the heavy work. The youngest horse, a spirited paint named Dancer, reminded me of myself, eager to please but not quite sure where she fit. "Do you know anything about horses?" Tom asked as Molly nuzzled my palm, searching for treats. "A little. My papa had a draft horse when I was small. I used to help him curry her coat." The memory came back sudden and sweet, standing on a wooden crate to reach Belle's broad back, Papa's steady hands guiding mine as I learned to work the brush in long, smooth strokes. Tom handed me a curry comb. "Would you like to help me with the morning grooming?" For the next hour, I lost myself in the rhythm of caring for the horses. My hands remembered the motions even after all these years, and the animals seemed to sense my genuine affection. Molly leaned into my touch, and even Buck, who Frank said was particular about who handled him, stood quietly while I worked. "You've got away with them," Tom observed, watching me braid Dancer's mane. "Animals know when someone understands them." The compliment warmed me more than it should have. At the mill, the only living things I'd interacted with were the rats that infested the dormitory, and my relationship with them had been purely adversarial. These horses made me feel useful in a way that had nothing to do with productivity quotas or avoiding punishment. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of new experiences. Tom taught me how to collect eggs from the hen house, explaining which hens were broody and which ones would peck if startled. He showed me his workshop, filled with tools for repairing equipment and building whatever the ranch needed. Most importantly, he talked to me like my opinions mattered, asking what I thought about this fence or that gate, listening to my answers with genuine attention. By midday, I was exhausted but happier than I'd been since childhood. The work was different from the mill, varied, purposeful, connected to living things rather than mechanical processes. My body ached in new places, but it was the good ache of muscles being used properly rather than the grinding pain of repetitive factory labor. We ate lunch on the porch, sharing sandwiches and watching the cattle move slowly across the pasture. The silence between us was comfortable now, filled with the sounds of the ranch coming alive around us, birds calling, cattle lowing, the distant ring of Frank's hammer as he repaired something in the barn. "Tom," I said finally, gathering courage to ask the question that had been building all morning, "why did you take me from the mill?" He was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual, like he was sharing something precious and fragile. 3 years ago, my wife Sarah died trying to birth our first child. The baby didn't make it either. He stared out at the mountains, his jaw tight with old pain. The doctor said there were complications that made it unlikely I'd ever father. Children. Something about the way things went wrong. I waited, understanding that this was a story he didn't tell often. This ranch was always meant to be a family place. Sarah and we had plans for children running through these pastures, learning to ride, helping with chores. After she died, I couldn't see the point of any of it. Barely kept the place going these past 3 years. He turned to look at me. Then his eyes serious but not sad. "When Judge Carter told me about your situation, something in my chest woke up. I thought maybe we could help each other. You needed a safe place to grow up, and I needed to remember what it felt like to care about someone's future again." His honesty took my breath away. I'd expected him to say he needed the help with chores or that he'd felt sorry for me. But this was something deeper, a recognition that we were both broken in ways that might fit together. "I'm not very good at being cared about," I admitted. "I might disappoint you." Tom shook his head firmly. "Kate, you've been here less than a day, and you've already brought more life to this place than it's seen in years. The way you talked to the horses, the careful way you collected those eggs, the questions you asked about everything, that's not someone who disappoints people. That's someone who pays attention to what matters." The afternoon brought new lessons. Tom showed me how to read the sky for weather, pointing out the clouds that meant rain and the wind patterns that warned of storms. He taught me to identify different grasses and explained which ones the cattle preferred. Most importantly, he shared the quiet knowledge that came from years of working with the land. How to move slowly enough that animals didn't startle. How to listen for the sounds that meant trouble. How to find water by watching where birds gathered. I absorbed everything hungrily, storing away each piece of information like a squirrel preparing for winter. This knowledge felt different from what I'd learned at the mill. There, everything was about efficiency and speed, about making machines run faster and produce more. Here the lessons were about patience and observation, about working with natural rhythms rather than fighting them. As evening approached, we returned to the house to prepare supper. Tom moved around the kitchen with the easy competence of someone who'd been cooking for himself for years. But he made space for me to help, showing me where things were kept and how he liked things done. Sarah was the real cook in the family, he said, slicing vegetables for a stew. I just learned enough to keep from starving, but she left some recipes written down if you'd like to try them sometime. The mention of his wife felt natural now, not like a painful secret he was hiding. I wondered if talking about her with me was easier because I was neutral territory. Someone who'd never known her, who wouldn't compare or judge or try to fill her place. I'd like that, I said, stirring the pot while he added seasonings. Mama was a good cook too before she got sick. She taught me some things, but I've forgotten a lot. We worked together in comfortable rhythm, and I found myself thinking that this was what family might feel like. Two people taking care of each other's needs without keeping score, sharing the day's work and the evening's rest. After supper, Tom disappeared into his study to work on ranch accounts while I explored the house more thoroughly. In the parlor, I found a shelf of books that made my heart leap. I'd been an eager reader before the mill, devouring everything Mama could find for me. At the factory, there'd been no time for reading and no books to read anyway. I was running my fingers along the spines when Tom found me. See anything interesting? You have so many books, I breathed, still not quite believing they were available to me. Would it be all right if I borrowed some? Tom's smile was the warmest I'd seen from him yet. Kate, everything in this house is as much yours as mine now. Read whatever you like, whenever you like. Sarah was a great reader too. Most of those are hers. I selected a volume of poetry and carried it up to my room, where I read by lamplight until my eyes grew heavy. The words on the page seemed to unlock something in my mind that had been closed off for 3 years, awakening a hunger I'd almost forgotten I possessed. Before I blew out the lamp, I knelt beside my bed as I had the night before. But tonight, my prayers were different, not just grateful for survival, but beginning to hope for something more. Tom had given me more than safety and shelter. He'd given me the first taste of what it might feel like to belong somewhere, to be valued for who I was rather than just what I could produce. Outside my window, the ranch settled into its evening quiet. I could hear Tom moving around downstairs, banking the fire and checking the doors. The sounds of his care felt like a lullaby, and I drifted off to sleep thinking that maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to understand what home really meant. Part 3. The Rhythm of Days. 3 weeks passed, like a gentle dream I was afraid to trust completely. Each morning brought new lessons and small discoveries that made the world feel larger and more welcoming than it ever had before. Tom proved to be a patient teacher, never making me feel foolish when I struggled with unfamiliar tasks or asked questions that probably seemed obvious to someone raised on a ranch. I learned to milk the cows, though Bessie, the oldest and most stubborn of the herd, seemed to take personal offense at my inexperience. She would switch her tail across my face and shift her weight just as I was getting settled, as if testing my determination. Tom watched my daily battles with Bessie with barely concealed amusement. "She's just making sure you're serious about being here," he explained one morning, after Bessie had knocked over my milk bucket for the third time in a week. Animals have their own way of deciding whether to trust someone. I wiped milk from my skirt and approached Bessie again, speaking to her in the low, soothing voice I'd discovered worked best with the horses. "Come now, Bessie. We both know. You're going to let me finish this job. We might as well do it the easy way." The cow regarded me with large, intelligent eyes, chewing thoughtfully. Then, as if she'd reached some internal decision, she settled herself more solidly and allowed me to complete the milking without further protest. "Well, I'll be," Tom said, grinning as I carried the full bucket to the house. "I think you just passed Bessie's test." The kitchen had become my favorite room in the house. Tom had cleaned out Sarah's recipe collection from a wooden box in the pantry, and I spent my evenings copying them into a notebook in my careful script. Some were simple farm fare, hearty stews and fresh bread, while others were more elaborate dishes she'd probably prepared for special occasions. Each recipe was a small window into the life of the woman who'd loved this place before me. I started with the simpler recipes, gradually building confidence as Tom praised my efforts and offered gentle suggestions. The first time I successfully made Sarah's cornbread, following her precise instructions for mixing and baking, Tom took a bite and closed his eyes with something that looked like contentment. "She'd be pleased," he said quietly. "Sarah always said food was how you showed people they mattered." The garden behind the house had been neglected since Sarah's death, but Tom helped me clear away 3 years of weeds and prepare the soil for a winter vegetable plot. My hands, already toughened by millwork, adapted quickly to the different demands of outdoor labor. I found I loved the feel of good earth between my fingers, the satisfaction of seeing ordered rows emerge from chaotic growth. "It's too late for most things this year," Tom explained as we worked side by side. "But we can get some hardy greens in the ground. Kale, turnips, maybe some late carrots." Sarah always said a garden was an act of faith. You plant, believing in future seasons you can't see yet. I understood what he meant. Every seed we planted was a promise that I would be here to harvest it, that this life we were building together had substance beyond the present moment. As I pressed carrot seeds into neat furrows, I found myself imagining spring, planning what I might plant when the ground warmed again. Frank Rodriguez had warmed to my presence gradually, the way a cautious animal learns to accept a new member of the herd. He'd started including me in his morning reports to Tom, explaining which cattle had wandered too close to the fence line, or noting signs of weather change in the animal's behavior. When he discovered I could read and write well, he began asking me to help with ranch records, appreciating my neat handwriting and careful attention to numbers. "Most folks don't understand how much thinking goes into ranch work," Frank told me one afternoon as we inventoried feed supplies. "They see the physical labor and miss all the planning and calculating that makes the difference between profit and loss." I'd never thought of myself as particularly good with numbers, but Frank's patient explanations helped me understand the complex equations that governed ranch life. How many cattle could a pasture support without overgrazing? How much hay needed to be stored to last through winter? When was the best time to sell steers for maximum profit? Each decision rippled through months of future consequences. The learning went both ways. My mill experience had taught me about efficiency and organization in ways that proved surprisingly useful on the ranch. I introduced a system for tracking which hens were laying regularly and which might need special attention. I organized Tom's workshop, grouping similar tools together and creating a simple inventory that would make it easier to spot when something was missing or needed repair. "You see patterns differently than I do," Tom observed one evening as we reviewed the day's work. "It's like you can hold the whole picture in your mind at once." His words made me think of the mill, where I'd learned to monitor multiple machines simultaneously, catching problems before they became disasters. But here, instead of preventing mechanical failures, I was helping nurture living systems that grew and changed and responded to care. The town of Millbrook remained a complicated place for me. When Tom took me to the general store for supplies, I felt the weight of curious stares and whispered speculation. Most people were polite enough, but I could sense their uncertainty about how to categorize my presence in Tom's life. Was I a ward, a servant, a charity case? The ambiguity seemed to make everyone uncomfortable except Tom, who introduced me simply as Kate and left others to draw their own conclusions. Mrs. Cooper, who ran the general store with her husband, was kinder than most. She remembered my parents from before they died and took time to ask about my adjustment to ranch life. When I mentioned that I was learning to cook from Sarah's recipes, her face softened with understanding. Sarah Mitchell was one of the finest women this valley ever knew, she said, carefully weighing out flour for our order. She'd be happy knowing her kitchen was being used with love again. Dr. Walsh, the town physician who had attended both Sarah and the baby during their final hours, stopped by the ranch one evening, ostensibly to check on a cut I'd received while learning to repair barbed wire. But I could tell his real purpose was to assess how Tom was managing with his unconventional household arrangement. "You're looking better than you have in years, Tom," he said, after examining my minor injury. More settled somehow. Tom's response was characteristically straightforward. Having someone to care about again makes a difference. Kate's been good for this place. The doctor's examination of my hands revealed that the damage from mill work was less severe than I'd feared. "You'll always have these scars," he said gently, "but there's no permanent loss of function. With good care, your hands will serve you well for many years to come." I thought about his words that night as I rubbed salve into my palms before bed. The scars were part of my story now, evidence of where I'd been, but not limitations on where I was going. Tom had been right when he called them working hands. They were proof of survival, of adaptation, of my willingness to do whatever was necessary to build a life worth living. The evenings had developed their own rhythm. After supper and clean-up, Tom would retreat to his study to work on accounts or correspondence while I settled in the parlor with one of Sarah's books. Sometimes he would join me, bringing his own reading or a piece of equipment that needed repair. We shared the lamplight in comfortable silence, each absorbed in our own tasks but aware of the other's presence. I was making my way through a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, finding unexpected comfort in his ideas about self-reliance and the importance of trusting one's own judgment. After years of being told I was inadequate in every meaningful way, Emerson's words felt like permission to believe in my own worth. One evening, I looked up from my book to find Tom watching me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "What is it?" I asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I was just thinking how different this room feels with you in it," he said. "Sarah used to sit in that same chair reading by lamplight, but you're not trying to be her, and that's good. This house needs new life, not a ghost." His words touched something deep in my chest, a fear I hadn't even known I was carrying. I worry sometimes that I'm taking her place in ways I shouldn't. Tom set down his papers and leaned forward, his expression serious but gentle. "Kate, Sarah will always have her place in my heart and in this house. But that doesn't mean there's no room for anyone else. You're not replacing her. You're writing your own story here, and I'm grateful every day that you're willing to include me in it." The honesty in his voice made my throat tight with emotion. I'd spent so many years believing I had nothing valuable to offer anyone, that my presence was at best tolerated and at worst resented. But Tom spoke like I was a gift he hadn't expected to receive, and that recognition was transforming something fundamental in how I saw myself. "I've never felt like I belonged anywhere before. I admitted. Even with Mama and Papa, I always felt like I was trying to be good enough to earn my place. Here, you make me feel like I already am good enough, just as I am. Tom's smile was warm and certain. That's because you are, Kate. You always were. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the small mirror above my washstand. The face looking back at me was still thin, still marked by the hardships of mill life, but something essential had changed. My eyes held a steadiness that hadn't been there when I arrived, and my shoulders no longer curved inward with the expectation of blows that never came. I was becoming someone new here, someone I might actually learn to like. The mill girl who had stepped off Judge Carter's courthouse steps 3 weeks ago felt like a stranger now, someone I remembered with compassion, but no longer identified with completely. This Kate, Ranch Kate, was discovering strengths and capabilities she'd never known she possessed. Outside my window, the October wind was picking up, carrying the scent of coming snow. Winter would bring new challenges and longer evenings, more time spent in close quarters with Tom as we weathered the mountain cold together. The prospect didn't frighten me the way it might have once. Instead, I found myself looking forward to the deeper intimacy of shared survival, to discovering what other hidden strengths might emerge when tested by necessity. I pulled Sarah's quilt up to my chin and listened to the familiar sounds of Tom securing the house for the night. His footsteps on the stairs, the soft closing of his bedroom door, the settling sighs of a house holding two people safe against the darkness outside. For the first time since my parents died, I fell asleep, feeling genuinely excited about tomorrow. Part 4. The test of winter November arrived with a vengeance, bringing the first serious snowfall and temperatures that made my breath visible even inside the barn. Tom had warned me that mountain winters were different from anything I might have experienced in town, but the reality was both harsher and more beautiful than I'd imagined. Snow piled against the windows in graceful drifts, and ice crystals formed intricate patterns on the glass that caught the morning light like captured jewels. The rhythm of ranch life shifted with the weather. Morning chores now included breaking ice on water troughs and carrying warm mash to chickens who huddled together for warmth. The cattle moved closer to the barn, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. Everything took longer when you had to account for numb fingers and slippery surfaces, but there was something deeply satisfying about the work, a sense that we were actively protecting the lives under our care. Tom insisted I have proper winter clothing, taking me to Millbrook for boots, a warm coat, and sturdy gloves. When I protested about the expense, he gave me a look that was both gentle and firm. Kate, you're not a burden on this ranch's budget. You're an investment in its future. Good equipment keeps you safe and healthy, which means you can work effectively. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I've gotten used to having you around. I'd rather not have you freeze to death just when you're getting good at milking. Bessie, the comment made me laugh, but it also made me realize how much my sense of my own value had changed. At the mill, every penny spent on our welfare had been grudged, presented as charity we should be grateful for. Tom spoke about my needs as natural and reasonable, worth providing for without question or resentment. The new boots were a revelation. For the first time in years, my feet stayed warm and dry even during the longest outdoor chores. I could walk confidently across icy ground, and the difference in my comfort level transformed my relationship with winter work. What had seemed like endurance became something closer to enjoyment. Frank Rodriguez proved to be an invaluable teacher during these colder months. He'd spent his entire life on mountain ranches and knew every trick for making winter work manageable. He showed me how to layer clothing for maximum warmth while maintaining freedom of movement, how to recognize the early signs of frostbite, and how to move efficiently through snow without exhausting myself. Winter separates the real ranch hands from the summer help He told me one particularly bitter morning as we worked together to repair a fence damaged by falling timber. "You're proving yourself to be the real thing, Miss Kate." His approval meant more to me than I'd expected. Frank didn't give compliments easily, and I'd seen him dismiss other workers who couldn't adapt to the demands of ranch life. Being accepted by him felt like passing an important test, earning my place in a community that valued competence and reliability above all else. The house felt different in winter, more intimate and self-contained. With darkness falling early, we spent longer evenings together, and I began to understand Tom's personality in deeper ways. He was naturally contemplative, someone who thought carefully before speaking and valued substance over small talk. But he also had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable, and he was endlessly patient with my questions about everything from astronomy to ranch management. Our conversations ranged widely during those long winter evenings. Tom had traveled more than I'd realized before settling down with Sarah, and he shared stories of places he'd seen and people he'd met that expanded my understanding of the world beyond the Colorado mountains. He described cities I'd only read, about landscapes I'd never imagined, and ways of life that seemed exotic and fascinating. In return, I found myself sharing memories of my parents and my life before the mill. Tom listened with genuine interest as I described Papa's work as a carpenter, the small house where we'd been happy, and Mama's dreams for my education. These weren't stories I'd told anyone in years, but something about winter evenings and lamplight made confidences feel natural and safe. "Your parents would be proud of who you're becoming," Tom said one night after I'd told him about Papa teaching me to read blueprints and understand basic carpentry principles. "They gave you tools for thinking and problem solving that serve you well here." I'd never connected my childhood learning with my current abilities, but Tom helped me see how Papa's lessons in measuring and planning translated directly to ranch work, and how Mama's emphasis on reading and critical thinking made me a more effective partner in managing the complex business of raising cattle. December brought news that changed everything. Though neither of us recognized its significance at first, Dr. Walsh stopped by on his rounds to check on an elderly neighbor and mentioned almost casually that a young woman had died in childbirth. In town, leaving behind a newborn daughter that no family had stepped forward to claim. "Tragic situation," he said, accepting a cup of coffee to warm himself before continuing his journey. The mother was unmarried, had been working as a seamstress to support herself. Baby's healthy, but the church is struggling to find someone willing to take her in. Folks are hesitant about raising a child under those circumstances. I felt something stir in my chest at his words, a feeling I couldn't quite name. What will happen to her? Dr. Walsh shrugged sadly. "If no one local comes forward, she'll probably be sent to the foundling home in Denver. Not ideal for a baby, but what choice is there?" After he left, I found myself thinking about the baby throughout the day. A little girl with no family, no one to speak for her or protect her interests. I remembered my own terror when I'd faced the possibility of being sent to the state workhouse, and my heart ached for a child too young to understand her abandonment. That evening, as Tom and I worked together preparing supper, I gathered courage to voice what had been building in my mind all day. "Tom, the baby Dr. Walsh mentioned, what do you think will happen to her at the foundling home?" Tom paused. In his stirring of the soup, his expression growing serious. "Nothing good. Those places are overcrowded and understaffed. Children die there regularly, and the ones who survive don't get much in the way of education or preparation for adult life. So she'd be like I was at the mill, essentially, unwanted and seen as a burden." Tom turned to face me fully, and I could see him beginning to understand where my thoughts were leading. "Kate, are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" I took a deep breath, knowing I was about to voice something that would change both our lives forever. I keep thinking about what you said when you took me from the mill, that maybe we could help each other. Maybe this baby needs what we needed 3 years ago. A chance to be part of a family instead of an institution. Tom set down his spoon and leaned against the counter, studying my face with the careful attention he gave to important decisions. Taking in a baby would change everything, Kate. The work, the responsibility, the way people see us. Are you sure you're ready for that? The question made me examine my own motivations honestly. Was this about the baby's needs, or was I trying to fill some emptiness in myself? Was I mature enough to take responsibility for another person's life? I know I'm young, I said finally. And I know I don't have experience with babies. But I also know what it feels like to be unwanted, and I know what it's like to have someone believe in your worth when no one else will. Maybe that's exactly what she needs. Tom was quiet for a long time, and I could see him working through the practical implications of what I was suggesting. 2 unmarried people raising a child together would certainly give the townspeople something to talk about. There would be legal complications, financial considerations, and the enormous daily reality of caring for an infant. If we did this, he said slowly, we'd be committing to 18 years of being a family together. Maybe longer. Are you prepared for that level of partnership? The word hung between us, loaded with implications neither of us had been ready to examine before. Partnership suggested something more permanent and equal than the guardian-ward relationship we'd been navigating. It suggested a shared future, shared decisions, shared responsibility for the choices that would shape all our lives. I think I am, I said quietly. Are you? Tom's smile was slow but genuine. Kate, you've been my partner since the day you arrived here. This would just make it official. 3 days later, we drove to town together to speak with Pastor Morrison about the abandoned baby. The conversation was awkward at first, with the pastor clearly uncertain about the propriety of our unusual household arrangement. But Tom's steady respectability and my obvious sincerity gradually convinced him that we were serious about providing a good home. The baby is being cared for temporarily by Mrs. Henderson, Pastor Morrison explained. She's healthy and strong, about 2 weeks old now. If you're serious about this, we could arrange for you to meet her. Mrs. Henderson lived in a small house near the church, and she greeted us with the weary expression of someone who'd been managing a difficult situation with limited resources. But her face softened when she saw the baby, and I could tell she'd grown attached despite herself. The baby was tiny, impossibly small and fragile-looking, wrapped in a knitted blanket. Her eyes were closed, and she made soft, sighing sounds as she slept. When Mrs. Henderson placed her in my arms, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest, a protective instinct so strong it took my breath away. "She's beautiful," I whispered, studying the delicate features and tiny fingers. "What's her name?" "She hasn't been named yet," Mrs. Henderson said sadly. "Her mother died before she could tell us what she'd chosen." I looked down at the sleeping baby, then up at Tom. He was watching both of us with an expression I'd never seen before. Wonder, mixed with something that might have been longing. "May I hold her?" he asked quietly. When I transferred the baby to Tom's arms, she opened her eyes for the first time since we'd arrived. They were dark blue, unfocused, but alert, and she seemed to study his face with serious attention. Tom's expression melted into something so tender it made my throat tight with emotion. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "We've been waiting for you." The words surprised me with their certainty, as if he'd already decided that this baby belonged with us. Looking at them together, this man who'd saved me from institutional life, now cradling a child who faced the same fate. I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we were going to face them as a family. "Her name is Hope," I said suddenly, the word coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Her name is Hope Mitchell. Tom looked up at me, and I saw my own recognition reflected in his eyes. This wasn't just about saving another unwanted child. This was about becoming the family we'd both lost, about proving that love could be chosen rather than just inherited. Hope Mitchell, he repeated softly, testing the sound. I like that. I like that very much. Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. Well then, I suppose we'd better start the paperwork to make it official. As we drove home through the December snow with Hope sleeping peacefully between us, I thought about the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, I'd been a mill girl with no prospects beyond industrial servitude. Now I was part of a family that had chosen each other deliberately, carefully, with full knowledge of what we were promising. The ranch looked different as we approached, more alive somehow, as if it had been waiting for this final piece to complete itself. Tom carried Hope inside while I gathered her few belongings, and together we stood in the parlor looking down at this tiny person who would reshape every aspect of our future. Are you scared? Tom asked quietly. I considered the question honestly. Terrified, I admitted, but also more certain about anything than I've ever been in my life. Tom nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. Then I guess we'd better figure out how to be parents. Hope stirred in his arms, making soft sounds that weren't quite cries, but suggested she was beginning to wake up. In a few minutes, she would need feeding, changing, comforting, the first of thousands of needs we would learn to meet together. I looked around the parlor, trying to see it through the eyes of a child who would grow up here, the books that would teach her to read, the windows that would frame her view of the mountains, the fireplace where we would tell her stories about her family and help her understand that sometimes the best families are the ones people choose to build together. Welcome home, Hope, I whispered, touching her tiny hand with one finger. The first weeks with Hope transformed our house into something entirely new, a place where every sound and silence took on deeper meaning. I discovered that babies spoke their own language, one I had to learn through careful observation and countless small failures. Hope's cries varied in pitch and intensity depending on whether she was hungry, tired, uncomfortable, or simply in need of human comfort. Learning to distinguish between these different needs became my most important education. Tom proved surprisingly adept at infant care, though he claimed to have no experience with babies. His large hands were impossibly gentle as he changed diapers and swaddled Hope in soft blankets, and he had an instinctive understanding of how to hold her so she felt secure. When I marveled at his natural ability, he smiled and said that animals had taught him to pay attention to wordless communication. Cattle can't tell you what's wrong when they're suffering, he explained one evening as he rocked Hope to sleep. You learn to read their posture, their breathing, the way they hold their heads. Babies aren't so different. They're telling you everything you need to know if you know how to listen. I spent hours watching Hope's face as she slept, memorizing the delicate curve of her eyebrows and the way her tiny mouth moved as if she were having important conversations in her dreams. Sometimes I would place my finger against her palm and feel amazed by the strength of her grip, the way her whole hand could curl around my fingertip like she was anchoring herself to the world through that small contact. The nights were the hardest part of our new routine. Hope woke every few hours needing to be fed, and since I was handling the bottle feeding while Tom managed the early morning ranch chores, I learned to function on broken sleep in ways that reminded me of the mill. But this exhaustion felt different, purposeful rather than grinding. When Hope's cries pulled me from sleep, I rose with a sense of being needed rather than being driven. Frank Rodriguez adapted to our expanded household with his characteristic pragmatism. He helped Tom construct a cradle from pine lumber, sanding every surface smooth and applying multiple coats of gentle finish to ensure no splinters could harm delicate skin. The cradle was simple but beautiful, with high sides to keep Hope safe, and rockers that moved with just the right amount of resistance. "Every baby needs a proper bed," Frank said, as he put the finishing touches on the cradle's edges. "My grandmother used to say that the first furniture a child knows shapes how safe they feel in the world." Dr. Walsh visited regularly during Hope's first month with us, checking her growth and giving me guidance on feeding schedules and what developmental milestones to expect. He seemed pleased with how she was thriving under our care, though I caught him studying our unconventional family arrangement with professional curiosity. "She's gaining weight well," he reported after one of his examinations. "Whatever you're doing, it's working. She's obviously loved, and babies know the difference." His words filled me with quiet pride. I'd had no training in childcare beyond the basic nurturing instincts every person possessed, but somehow I was managing to provide what Hope needed. When she smiled for the first time, a sudden bright expression that transformed her whole face, I felt like I'd witnessed a miracle. The town's reaction to our adoption of Hope was mixed, as we'd expected. Some people, particularly the women with children of their own, offered practical advice and occasional help. Mrs. Cooper from the general store brought over baby clothes that her own children had outgrown, and Mrs. Henderson stopped by weekly to check on Hope's progress and offer encouragement. But others whispered behind their hands about the impropriety of our situation. An unmarried man and woman raising a child together, especially when that woman was still technically a minor herself, challenged their understanding of proper family arrangements. I heard fragments of conversation when we visited town, speculation about our relationship and whether Hope would be properly raised without a real mother and father. Tom addressed these concerns in his characteristically direct way when Pastor Morrison approached him after church one Sunday morning. "Tom, I have to ask," the pastor said, his voice carefully neutral. "Are you and Kate planning to marry? People are asking, and I think they'd be more comfortable with your arrangement if they understood your intentions." Tom's response was calm but firm. "Pastor, Kate and I are committed to raising Hope together and providing her with the most loving, stable home possible. The legal details of our relationship are less important than our shared dedication to her welfare. If that makes people uncomfortable, that's their concern, not ours." I appreciated that he didn't try to define our relationship in terms that would satisfy social expectations. The truth was that what existed between Tom and me didn't fit neatly into conventional categories. We were partners in every meaningful sense, sharing responsibility for Hope's care and the ranch's management, but we'd never discussed romance or marriage in explicit terms. Sometimes, though, I caught myself wondering about those unspoken possibilities. When Tom smiled at something Hope did, or when he praised my handling of a difficult situation, I felt warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with paternal affection. These feelings confused me because I had no experience with romantic attachment, no framework for understanding what I might be feeling or whether it was appropriate to feel it. The confusion became more intense one evening in February, when a blizzard struck the valley with unusual fury. The wind howled around the house like a living thing, and snow piled against the windows in drifts that blocked out most of the light. Tom had gone out to check on the animals during a brief lull in the storm, but when the wind picked up again, I began to worry about his safety. Hope was fussy that evening, unsettled by the atmospheric pressure and the strange sounds the storm was making. I walked the floors with her for hours, singing the lullabies Mama had sung to me, and trying not to let my anxiety about Tom affect my ability to comfort her. When she finally fell asleep, I placed her in the cradle and went to the kitchen window to watch for any sign of Tom's return. The world outside was completely white, visibility reduced to just a few feet beyond the glass. I could see the faint glow of the barn lantern, but no movement that might indicate where Tom was, or whether he was safe. As the hours passed, my worry deepened into something approaching panic. When the kitchen door finally opened and Tom stumbled, inside, covered in snow and shaking with cold, I threw myself into his arms without thinking. The relief was so overwhelming that I burst into tears, clinging to him while he stood shocked and dripping in the doorway. "Kate, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice muffled by my hair. "I'm fine. Just took longer than expected to get the animals settled." "I thought something had happened to you," I sobbed against his coat. "I kept thinking about what Hope and I would do if you didn't come back, and I realized I can't imagine this life without you in it." Tom's arms came around me then, holding me with a tenderness that made my tears flow harder. We stood like that for several minutes, just holding each other while the storm raged outside and Hope slept peacefully in the next room. When I finally pulled back to look at his face, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart race. "Kate," he said softly, his hands still resting on my shoulders, "I need to tell you something I've been thinking about for weeks." I waited, hardly breathing, while he gathered his thoughts. "When I first brought you here, I told myself I was helping a girl who needed a safe place to grow up. But watching you with Hope, seeing how you've made this house into a real home again, I've realized that somewhere along the way, my feelings changed into something I wasn't expecting." He paused, studying my face carefully. "I love you, Kate. Not like a guardian loves a ward, but like a man loves a woman. And I know you're young, and I know our situation is complicated, but I needed you to know how I feel." The words hit me like a physical force, confirming feelings I'd been trying to understand for months. "Tom," I whispered, reaching up to touch his face, "I love you too. I didn't know what it was called, but I've felt it growing for so long." What happened next felt as natural as breathing. Tom leaned down and kissed me with infinite gentleness, and I kissed him back with all the emotion I'd been carrying unnamed. In my heart, it was my first kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise, and when it ended, I felt like the last piece of my new identity had finally clicked into place. "We should probably talk about what this means," Tom said, his forehead resting against mine. I smiled, feeling more certain about my future than I ever had before. "It means we're a real family now. It means Hope has parents who love each other, as well as her. It means we're going to build something beautiful together." Tom's answering smile was radiant. "Then I guess I should ask you properly. Kate Sullivan, will you marry me?" The proposal was simple and perfect, offered in our warm kitchen while our daughter slept safely nearby, and the storm that had brought us to this moment of truth continued to rage outside. My answer came without hesitation. "Yes, Tom Mitchell, I'll marry you." We married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony in Pastor Morrison's study, with Frank Rodriguez and Mrs. Henderson serving as witnesses. I wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Cooper had helped me alter, and Tom wore his best suit with a white shirt that made his brown eyes look even warmer than usual. Hope slept through the entire ceremony, wrapped in a blanket Frank's wife had knitted especially for the occasion. The ceremony itself was brief and straightforward, but the words we spoke to each other felt weighted with all the history that had brought us to this moment. When Pastor Morrison pronounced us husband and wife, I felt a completeness I'd never known was possible. Tom kissed me in front of our small gathering of witnesses, and I heard Mrs. Henderson sniffle with emotion. "Well," Pastor Morrison said, beaming at our little family, "I think this calls for some celebration." We returned to the ranch as a legally recognized family, and that evening we sat together in the parlor with Hope between us, marveling at how much our lives had changed since that day in Judge Carter's courthouse. Tom had built a fire in the fireplace, and the warm light flickered across Hope's peaceful face as she slept. "Do you think she'll remember any of this when she's older?" I asked, adjusting the blanket around her tiny form. Tom considered the question seriously. "Maybe not the details, but I think children absorb more than we realize about the emotional climate they're raised in. She'll grow up knowing she was wanted, knowing she was the final piece that made our family complete." I leaned against Tom's shoulder, feeling the solid comfort of his presence and the quiet satisfaction of Hope's gentle breathing. "I keep thinking about what you said that first day, about maybe we could help each other. I don't think either of us imagined it would turn into this." Tom's arm tightened around me. "The best things in life usually surprise you. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be married to a remarkable woman and raising a beautiful daughter, I would have thought they were delusional. And if someone had told me I'd go from mill girl to ranch wife and mother in less than a year, I would have laughed until I cried." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire and listening to the sounds of our house settling around us. Outside, the February wind was gentler now, no longer the howling fury of the blizzard, but a steady whisper that spoke of winter beginning its slow retreat toward spring. "Tom," I said eventually, "what do you think we should tell Hope about where she came from when she's old enough to ask?" Tom was quiet for a moment, considering. "The truth, I think, that her birth mother loved her enough to bring her into the world, even though it cost her own life, that she came to us when we needed her as much as she needed us, that families can be built in many different ways, and all of them are valid as long as they're founded on love." His answer made me think about my own story, the journey that had brought me from orphaned mill worker to beloved wife and mother. Hope would grow up knowing she was chosen, wanted, celebrated. She would never doubt her worth or her place in the world the way I had for so many years. "I want to make sure she knows she can tell us anything," I said. "That she never has to hide parts of herself or pretend to be something she's not to earn our love." Tom nodded emphatically. "She'll know. We'll make sure she knows." Hope stirred in her sleep, making the soft sighing sounds that had become such a familiar part of our daily symphony. I reached over to adjust her blanket, and her tiny hand curled reflexively around my finger. Even in sleep, she seemed to understand that she was safe, surrounded by people who would protect her and cherish her for exactly who she was. As the fire burned lower and the evening deepened around us, I reflected on the strange, miraculous series of events that had brought us all together. Tom's desperate need for family, my escape from industrial servitude, Hope's abandonment that had turned into the greatest gift any of us could have received. Each piece of our story had seemed like tragedy or hardship when it was happening, but together they had created something beautiful and lasting. I thought about Mama and Papa and how they would have loved this moment. They had raised me to believe in the possibility of love and family, even though their own lives had been cut short by circumstances beyond their control. In some way, raising Hope felt like honoring their memory, passing forward the lessons they had taught me about nurturing and protecting the people you loved. "I think they would be proud," I murmured, half to myself. Tom understood immediately who I meant. "Your parents, they would be incredibly proud. They raised a daughter who turned hardship into strength, who chose love over bitterness, who built a family out of broken pieces. That's not easy to do." His words made my throat tight with emotion, but it was a good tightness, the kind that came from being truly seen and valued by someone who mattered. I had spent so many years believing I was fundamentally damaged, incapable of the kind of love that created lasting bonds. But here I was, married to a man who cherished me, and raising a daughter who would grow up knowing she was the center of our universe. The transformation felt almost impossible to believe, except that I was living it every day, Every morning when I woke up next to Tom, every time Hope smiled at the sound of my voice, every evening when we gathered together in this parlor that had become the heart of our home, I was reminded that sometimes life could exceed your wildest hopes. As we prepared for bed that night, moving through the routines of checking on Hope and banking the fire and turning down the lamps, I marveled at how natural it all felt. Marriage hadn't changed the essential dynamic between Tom and me so much as it had given us permission to acknowledge what had been growing between us for months. When we reached the top of the stairs, Tom paused outside what had been my room for the past several months. "I had Frank move your things to our room while we were in town," he said quietly. "But if you need time to adjust, if you want to keep your own space for a while longer." I silenced his worried words with a kiss, pouring all my love and certainty into the contact. When we broke apart, his eyes were warm with relief and something deeper. "I'm ready, Tom. I've been ready for longer than I knew." Our bedroom was larger than my old room, with windows that looked out over the valley, and furniture that Tom had built himself during the early years of his marriage to Sarah. But it didn't feel like I was intruding on sacred space. Instead, it felt like a room that had been waiting for new love, new hopes, new dreams to fill its corners and make it complete again. That night, as I lay in Tom's arms listening to Hope's gentle breathing from the cradle beside our bed, I thought about how much I had learned about love in the past year. Love wasn't just the romantic feeling between Tom and me, though that was precious and transforming. It was also the fierce protectiveness I felt for Hope, the daily choice to put her needs before my own comfort. It was the gratitude I felt for Frank's steady friendship and Mrs. Henderson's maternal concern. It was the way the community had gradually come to accept our unconventional family, recognizing that love could create valid bonds regardless of how traditional they appeared. Most importantly, I had learned to love myself. The mill girl who had stood in Judge Carter's office with downcast eyes and shoulders curved in expectation of rejection had been replaced by a woman who knew her own worth. I had discovered that I was capable of learning, growing, contributing, nurturing. I was someone worthy of Tom's love and capable of raising Hope to be strong and confident and kind. As I drifted towards sleep, I whispered a prayer of thanksgiving for the series of unlikely events that had brought us all together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but tonight we were complete. Tonight we were exactly where we belonged, and that was enough to build a lifetime on. Part 4, Shadows and Light. Spring arrived gradually that year, creeping across the valley in increments so small that each day's change was barely perceptible until suddenly the world was green and alive again. Hope had grown remarkably in her first months with us, developing from the tiny, fragile baby we'd brought home in December into a robust infant who smiled readily and had begun to show distinct preferences for certain toys and songs. I delighted in tracking her development, noting in a journal when she first rolled over, when she began to reach deliberately for objects, when her random sounds started to seem more like intentional communication. Tom proved to be as fascinated by these milestones as I was, often spending his evenings sitting beside her cradle, talking to her in the gentle voice he used with nervous animals. "She's going to be smart," he observed one afternoon as we watched Hope study a wooden rattle with intense concentration. "Look how she examines everything, like she's trying to figure out how the world works." "She gets that from you," I replied, smiling as Hope succeeded in bringing the rattle to her mouth for a thorough investigation. "You approach everything the same way, like there's always more to understand if you pay close enough attention." Tom laughed and reached over to tickle Hope's feet, eliciting a delighted giggle that never failed to make both of us smile. "Well, then she's in trouble, because you're the one with the real brains in this family. I just know cattle and weather." Indeed, his self-deprecation was characteristic but inaccurate. Tom possessed a kind of practical intelligence that I'd come to recognize as invaluable. He could assess complex situations quickly, seeing all the interconnected factors that others might miss. He understood systems, whether they involved livestock management, weather patterns, or human relationships, and he had an instinct for finding solutions that addressed root causes rather than just surface problems. These abilities served us well when we faced our first serious challenge as a family. In early May, Judge Carter arrived at our ranch unannounced, accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize. She was middle-aged and expensively dressed, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. The serious expressions on both their faces immediately put me on alert. "Tom, Kate," Judge Carter said after we'd invited them into the parlor. "This is Mrs. Whitman from the Territorial Child Welfare Bureau. She's here to conduct an evaluation of Hope's placement with your family." My blood turned cold. I had heard about child welfare investigations, how bureaucrats could remove children from loving homes based on paperwork and regulations that had nothing to do with actual child welfare. I instinctively moved closer to Hope's cradle, as if my physical presence could protect her from whatever threat these visitors represented. Mrs. Whitman spoke in the clipped, professional tone of someone accustomed to wielding authority. "I've received a complaint about the irregularity of this adoption arrangement. The concerns raised include the youth of Mrs. Mitchell, the unusual circumstances of her own background, and questions about whether this household provides an appropriate environment for raising a child." Tom's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "What specific concerns need to be addressed?" Mrs. Whitman consulted a folder of papers. "The complainant suggests that Mrs. Mitchell lacks the maturity and experience necessary for child rearing. Given her background as a mill worker and her age at the time, the adoption was arranged. There are also questions about the financial stability of the household and whether a ranch environment is suitable for an infant." I felt anger rising in my chest, the hot fury that came from being judged by people who knew nothing about my actual capabilities or circumstances. But Tom caught my eye and gave me a slight shake of his head, reminding me that losing my temper would only confirm their preconceptions about my supposed immaturity. "Mrs. Whitman," Tom said calmly, "I'd like to invite you to spend the day observing our household routines. See how Hope is cared for, examine our living conditions, and speak with community members who can attest to our character and competence." "Would that be acceptable?" Mrs. Whitman nodded curtly. "That would be appropriate. I'll need to observe feeding routines, sleeping arrangements, and general childcare practices. I'll also want to examine your financial records and speak with neighbors and local officials." What followed was one of the most stressful days of my life. Mrs. Whitman watched everything I did with Hope, noting how I held her, how I prepared her bottles, how I responded to her needs. She examined every room of our house, opening closets and drawers as if searching for evidence of neglect or impropriety. She questioned me extensively about my background, my education, my understanding of child development. Through it all, I forced myself to remain calm and answer her questions honestly. I explained how I'd learned to read and write from my parents, demonstrated my knowledge of basic mathematics and household management, and described the research I'd done about infant care using books from Tom's collection. When she asked about my mill experience, I framed it as evidence of my work ethic and ability to handle responsibility under difficult circumstances. Tom proved to be an invaluable ally during the investigation. He presented our financial records with quiet confidence, showing that the ranch was profitable and our expenses well managed. He spoke about my contributions to the household with respect and appreciation, making it clear that he considered me an equal partner rather than an inexperienced child he was sheltering. Most importantly, Frank Rodriguez and several of our neighbors came forward voluntarily to speak on our behalf. Mrs. Cooper from the general store praised my intelligence and maturity, describing how I'd helped her organize inventory and handle complex customer requests. Dr. Walsh provided a glowing report of Hope's health and development, emphasizing that she showed every sign of being well cared for and loved. But it was Pastor Morrison's testimonial that seemed to carry the most weight with Mrs. Whitman. He spoke about the transformation he'd witnessed in our family, the way our love for each other had created something beautiful and stable out of difficult circumstances. "I've been ministering to families in this community for 15 years, he told Mrs. Whitman. "I've seen many different types of households, and I can tell you without reservation that Hope Mitchell is one of the most loved and well cared for children I've ever encountered. Her parents may be young, but they're devoted to her welfare in ways that many biological parents never achieve." Mrs. Whitman spent considerable time observing my interactions with Hope, and I could see her initial skepticism beginning to soften as she watched us together. Hope was at her most charming that day, smiling and laughing and demonstrating the secure attachment that Dr. Walsh had taught me to recognize as a sign of healthy development. When Hope fell asleep in my arms during her afternoon nap, refusing to settle until I was holding her, Mrs. Whitman made a note in her folder that seemed significant. "She clearly has a strong bond with you," Mrs. Whitman observed. "That's not something that develops overnight or without consistent responsive care." By evening, I could sense that Mrs. Whitman's assessment had shifted considerably from her initial concerns. When she asked to speak privately with Tom and me after Hope was settled for the night, I felt cautiously optimistic about what she might say. "I want to be frank with you both," Mrs. Whitman began, settling into the chair across from us in the parlor. "The complaint against your family raised serious allegations about child welfare. However, my investigation today has revealed no evidence to support those concerns." Relief flooded through me, but Mrs. Whitman held up a hand to indicate she wasn't finished. "In fact, what I've observed is quite the opposite. Hope is thriving under your care, your household is stable and well managed, and your community support is exceptional. Mrs. Mitchell, while you are young, you demonstrate remarkable maturity and competence in childcare. Mr. Mitchell, your commitment to your family is evident in every aspect of your home and business." She paused, consulting her notes. "I will be filing a report recommending that Hope remain in your custody permanently. However, I do want to offer some advice for your consideration." Tom and I exchanged glances, wondering what conditions might be attached to our victory. "Given the unusual circumstances of your family formation, you may continue to face scrutiny from people who don't understand or approve of your choices. I would recommend maintaining detailed records of Hope's development, healthcare, and education. Consider joining community organizations that will provide additional character witnesses. Most importantly, remember that your family's success will be the best answer to any future criticism." Judge Carter, who had remained silent during Mrs. Whitman's assessment, finally spoke. "Tom, Kate, I owe you an apology. The complaint that triggered this investigation came from someone who clearly didn't understand the reality of your situation. I should have dismissed it without subjecting your family to this stress." "Who made the complaint?" Tom asked, though his tone suggested he might already suspect. Judge Carter looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Hayes from the textile mill. She claimed that Kate was too damaged by her mill experience to be fit for motherhood, and that the adoption was somehow improper or coercive." The irony was bitter. Mrs. Hayes, who had treated me with such contempt during my mill years, had tried to destroy the happiness I'd found by portraying my past as evidence of unfitness rather than strength. But her attempt had backfired, forcing us to demonstrate publicly the depth of our love and commitment to each other. After our visitors left, Tom and I sat together in the parlor, emotionally drained but relieved beyond measure. Hope slept peacefully, in her cradle, unaware of how close she'd come to being removed from the only family she'd ever known. "I keep thinking about what Mrs. Whitman said," I murmured, leaning against Tom's shoulder. "About how our family's success will be the best." Answer to criticism. Tom's arm tightened around me. "She's right. People like Mrs. Hayes will always exist. People who can't see past conventional definitions of worth and propriety. But we don't have to live our lives according to their limitations." "I was so angry today," I admitted, "when Mrs. Whitman questioned my fitness as a mother, when she implied that my mill background made me unsuitable for raising Hope. I wanted to tell her exactly what I thought of her assumptions." Tom chuckled softly. "I could see you fighting not to lose your temper. I was proud of how you handled yourself. You proved your maturity better than any argument could have." I thought about the long day of scrutiny, the feeling of being judged by people who knew nothing about my actual life or relationships, but I also thought about the community support we'd received, the way our neighbors had rallied to defend our family without being asked. "We're not alone in this," I said, realizing the truth of it as I spoke. "Even when people try to tear us down, there are others who see our worth and will stand up for us." Tom nodded. "That's what community really means. Not everyone has to understand or approve of your choices, but the people who matter will recognize authenticity when they see it." Hope stirred in her sleep, making the soft sounds that usually preceded waking. I rose to check on her, and she opened her eyes as I approached the cradle. When she saw my face, she smiled with the radiant joy that never failed to melt my heart completely. "Hello, sweetheart," I whispered, lifting her into my arms. "Did you have a good nap?" She babbled something that sounded almost like words, reaching up to touch my face with her tiny hands. Tom joined us, and Hope's smile grew even brighter at the sight of both her parents together. "She knows," Tom said softly, watching Hope's animated response to our presence. "She knows she's safe, she knows she's loved. That's all that really matters." I held Hope close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair and feeling the solid warmth of her body against mine. Mrs. Hayes had tried to use my past against me, to suggest that the hardships I'd endured had made me unfit for love and family. But she had been wrong in the most fundamental way possible. Those hardships had taught me the value of safety, of kindness, of unconditional love. They had made me determined to give Hope everything I had been denied during my own childhood. My experience at the mill hadn't broken me. It had made me stronger, more compassionate, more committed to protecting the vulnerable. "I think," I said slowly, "that Mrs. Hayes did us a favor, even though she didn't mean to." Tom raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "She forced us to articulate why our family works, to put into words what we might have just taken for granted. She made our community rally around us in ways that strengthen all our relationships, and she proved that we can survive challenges to our legitimacy and come out stronger." Tom's smile was proud and loving. "Trust you to find the silver lining in an attempt to destroy our happiness. I learned a long time ago that you have to make meaning out of whatever life gives you," I replied. "Mrs. Hayes meant to hurt us, but instead she helped us understand how solid our foundation really is." That night, as we settled into our evening routines, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life we'd built together. The investigation had been stressful and invasive, but it had also confirmed what I'd known in my heart. Hope belonged with us, and we belonged with her. No bureaucrat or bitter mill overseer could change that fundamental truth. I thought about the future, about the challenges Hope would face as she grew up in a family that didn't conform to conventional expectations. But I also thought about the strength she would develop from being raised by parents who had chosen each other deliberately, who had overcome significant obstacles to create something beautiful together. Hope would grow up knowing that families could be built through love rather than just genetics, that resilience was more valuable than social approval, and that the people who truly mattered would always recognize authentic love when they encountered it. Those were lessons worth teaching, and I felt privileged to be the one who would help her learn them. As I drifted off to sleep that night, listening to the gentle sounds of my husband's breathing and my daughter's soft sighs, I knew that we had passed an important test. We had proven to ourselves and our community that our love was strong enough to withstand scrutiny, criticism, and attempts at separation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight we were safe, together, and more committed than ever to the family we had chosen to create. And that was more than enough to build a lifetime of happiness on. Part 5. Full Circle. By Hope's first birthday in December, our family had settled into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. The baby who had once seemed so fragile and dependent had grown into a robust toddler, with her father's steady brown eyes and a curiosity about everything in her environment that reminded me of myself at that age. She had begun taking her first tentative steps, using furniture and our legs for support as she explored the boundaries of her expanding world. Watching Hope develop her own personality was one of the greatest joys of my life. She was naturally sociable, smiling readily at visitors and showing no fear of new experiences. When Frank brought his guitar to play music on Sunday evenings, Hope would clap her hands and bob up and down in what we generously called dancing. She loved being outside, reaching for flowers and birds with the confident assumption that everything beautiful was meant for her to touch. Tom proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, spending hours patiently showing Hope how things worked and responding to her babbled questions with the same serious attention he gave to adult conversation. He had built her a small rocking horse from pine wood, sanding it smooth and painting it a cheerful yellow that brightened the parlor where she played. "She's going to be fearless," Tom observed one afternoon as we watched Hope attempt to climb onto the rocking horse by herself, determined to master this new challenge without assistance. "Look how she just assumes she can do whatever she sets her mind to." "I hope she keeps that assumption," I replied, steadying Hope when her enthusiasm exceeded her balance. "The world will try to teach her limitations soon enough." Tom's expression grew thoughtful. "We'll have to be careful about that. Make sure we encourage her independence while keeping her safe." These conversations about Hope's future had become more frequent as she grew older and more interactive. We talked about education, about values we wanted to instill, about how to prepare her for a world that might not always appreciate a girl raised to believe in her own capabilities. I was determined that Hope would never doubt her worth the way I had been forced to do. The ranch had prospered during our second year together, partly due to favorable weather and cattle prices, but also because of the energy and focus our family happiness had brought to the work. Tom and I had developed an efficient partnership in managing both household and business responsibilities, with each of us taking on tasks that suited our strengths and interests. I had discovered an unexpected aptitude for the record-keeping and planning aspects of ranch management. My mill experience with tracking production quotas and managing complex schedules translated well to cattle breeding programs and seasonal work planning. Tom joked that I had turned ranching into a science, but he appreciated the efficiency and profitability that resulted from systematic approaches to breeding, feeding, and marketing decisions. The garden I had started the previous year had expanded into something approaching a small farm, providing vegetables not only for our own table, but for sale to neighbors and the general store in Millbrook. I found deep satisfaction in coaxing food from the soil, in preserving the abundance of summer for lean winter months, in creating something beautiful and nourishing with my own hands. "You have a gift for this," Mrs. Cooper told me one day as she examined a basket of tomatoes I'd brought to trade at her store. "These are the finest vegetables I've seen in this valley. Have you considered selling at the farmer's market in Denver?" The suggestion intrigued me. Denver was still a significant journey from our valley, but the idea of reaching a larger market for our produce appealed to both my practical nature and my desire to contribute meaningfully to our family's financial security. When I mentioned Mrs. Cooper's idea to Tom that evening, his response was immediately supportive. "If you want to try selling in Denver, we should explore that possibility." 3 years had passed since that December morning when we first brought Hope home, and the transformation in all our lives seemed almost miraculous in its completeness. Hope had grown into a confident 4-year-old with an insatiable curiosity about everything from why snow fell to how the cattle knew to come home at evening. Her vocabulary had exploded over the past year, and she peppered us with questions that often required serious thought to answer properly. Tom had proven to be extraordinarily patient with her endless inquiries, treating each question as worthy of genuine consideration. When Hope asked why some flowers were red and others yellow, he spent an entire afternoon showing her different plants and explaining about seeds and soil and the way living things adapted to their environments. When she wondered why the mountains looked purple in the distance, he carried her to the highest hill on our property and helped her understand how air and light played tricks on human eyes. I cherished these moments of watching Tom with our daughter, seeing how naturally he had embraced fatherhood despite having no previous experience with children. He possessed an instinctive understanding of how to nurture Hope's development without overwhelming her with information she wasn't ready to process. His explanations were always simple enough for her to grasp while still respecting her intelligence. My own relationship with Hope had deepened beyond anything I could have imagined when we first decided to adopt her. The fierce protectiveness I'd felt as her caregiver had evolved into something more complex and nuanced as she developed her own personality and preferences. I loved watching her discover the world, but I also had to learn when to step back and allow her to make her own mistakes and discoveries. Hope had inherited my love of reading, though at 4, she was still learning to recognize letters and simple words. Every evening after supper, the 3 of us would gather in the parlor for story time, with Hope nestled between Tom and me as I read from the collection of children's books we'd gradually accumulated. She had definite preferences about which stories she wanted to hear, and she could recite several of her favorites word for word. "Read the one about the little horse again," she would request, settling herself more comfortably against my side. The one who thought she was too small, but then saved everyone. I understood why that particular story appealed to her. Even at 4, Hope seemed to identify with characters who proved themselves through determination rather than natural advantages. She had the confidence of a child who had never been told she wasn't good enough, but she also had an intuitive understanding that worth had to be demonstrated through actions. The ranch had continued to prosper under our management, but more importantly, it had become a true home in ways that went beyond mere financial success. We had established traditions and routines that gave shape and meaning to our days, seasons, that brought their own rhythms of work and celebration, connections with neighbors that created a web of mutual support and friendship. Frank Rodriguez had become more than just a hired hand. He was family in all the ways that mattered. Hope called him Uncle Frank and climbed onto his lap whenever he sat down, chattering about her day while he listened with the same serious attention. He gave to adult conversation. When Frank's wife, Maria, finally joined him permanently on the ranch, moving from her sister's house in town, our extended family grew even stronger. Maria brought her own gifts to our household, including exceptional skill with needlework and a talent for preserving foods that complemented my gardening efforts perfectly. She and I worked together to establish a more comprehensive kitchen garden, and we spent autumn days canning vegetables and fruits that would sustain both families through the winter months. "You have good instincts with the land," Maria told me one afternoon as we harvested the last of the season's tomatoes. "Not everyone understands how to listen to what the earth is telling them." Her approval meant a great deal to me because Maria had grown up on farms and understood the subtle skills required to coax abundance from sometimes reluctant soil. Under her guidance, I learned to read weather patterns more accurately, to understand which plants grew well together, and to plan crop rotations that would maintain soil fertility year after year. Hope delighted in helping with garden work, though her contributions were more enthusiastic than efficient. She loved digging in the dirt and was fascinated by the process of planting seeds and watching them grow into recognizable vegetables. When she successfully grew her own small patch of radishes from seed to harvest, her pride was infectious. "Look, Mama Kate," she announced, holding up a radish she'd just pulled from the ground. "I made this myself." The phrase Mama Kate had evolved naturally as Hope's vocabulary developed. She understood that our family was different from others she encountered, but she had never shown any confusion or distress about having parents who weren't her biological mother and father. To her, family simply meant the people who loved her unconditionally and took care of her needs. When other children asked about her family structure, Hope would explain matter-of-factly that her first mama had died when she was born, but that Mama Kate and Papa Tom had chosen her to be their daughter. She spoke about this with the confidence of a child who had never been made to feel that her origins were shameful or problematic. The town of Millbrook had gradually come to accept our unconventional family, though acceptance had been hard-won rather than freely given. Our success in raising Hope into a healthy, happy child had gone a long way towards silencing critics who had initially questioned our fitness as parents. The fact that Hope was obviously thriving, combined with our continued contributions to community life, had earned us a place in local society that felt secure and genuine. Dr. Walsh had become something of an advocate for our family, often mentioning Hope's excellent health and development when other parents expressed concerns about children in unusual circumstances. Pastor Morrison had also proved to be a steady supporter, occasionally using our family as an example in sermons about how love could create strong foundations regardless of how unconventional they might appear. But it was the everyday interactions with neighbors and townspeople that meant the most to me. When Mrs. Cooper's granddaughter came to play with Hope, when other mothers asked my advice about child-rearing challenges, when the school teacher mentioned that she looked forward to having Hope as a student. In a few years, these ordinary acceptances felt like victories worth celebrating. The Denver Farmers Market venture had proved more successful than any of us had anticipated. What had started as an experiment in selling surplus vegetables had grown into a regular source of income that contributed significantly to our household budget. The quality of our produce had quickly established a reputation among Denver customers, and we now had regular buyers who specifically sought out our stall every week. Tom had supported the expansion of our market business with typical thoughtfulness, helping me design more efficient transportation methods and scheduling his own work to accommodate my weekly trips to the city. The long journeys to Denver had also given me opportunities to see more of the world beyond our valley, to observe different ways of living and thinking that broadened my perspective on life's possibilities. "You've built something real here," Tom observed one evening as we tallied the week's market earnings. "This isn't just extra income, it's becoming a genuine business enterprise." His pride in my accomplishments never failed to warm my heart. Tom had always treated my contributions to our household as valuable and important, but seeing something I had started from nothing grow into a significant source of income had given me a new understanding of my own capabilities. Hope often accompanied Me on shorter trips to nearby towns, riding proudly beside me on the wagon seat and observing everything with intense interest. These expeditions were educational for both of us. She learned about different types of people and places, while I gained practice in managing business relationships while caring for an active child. "Mama Kate," Hope said during one of these trips, "why do some people look at us funny when they find out Papa Tom isn't your real daddy?" The question caught me off guard, though I realized I should have anticipated it. Hope was old enough now to notice social dynamics and curious enough to want explanations for things that seemed unusual to her. "People sometimes expect families to look a certain way," I explained carefully, "and when they meet families that are different from what they're used to, it can confuse them. But there are many different ways to make a family, and all of them are good as long as everyone loves and takes care of each other." Hope considered this explanation with the seriousness she brought to all new information. "So we're different but not wrong." "Exactly right, sweetheart. We're different but not wrong." Her acceptance of this concept seemed complete and untroubled, which relieved my concerns about how she might internalize other people's occasional puzzlement about our family structure. Hope possessed a natural confidence that I was determined to protect and nurture, understanding that this confidence would serve her well as she encountered more complex social situations in the future. The approaching winter brought news that would test our family's stability in ways we hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Hayes, the mill overseer who had tried to have Hope removed from our custody 2 years earlier, had written to territorial authorities claiming that new information had come to light about my background that called into question my fitness as a parent. Judge Carter delivered this news in person, clearly uncomfortable about having to discuss the matter with us again. "I'm required to inform you that Mrs. Hayes has made additional allegations about Kate's mental state and suitability for child rearing. She claims to have witness statements from former mill workers attesting to Kate's unstable behavior during her employment there. The accusations were particularly painful because they attacked not just my current situation, but my entire past, suggesting that the trauma I had experienced at the mill had left me psychologically damaged in ways that made me dangerous to Hope's welfare. Mrs. Hayes was attempting to use my suffering against me to transform my survival of difficult circumstances into evidence of unfitness." Tom's reaction was swift and decisive. "Judge Carter, these allegations are clearly motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine concern for Hope's welfare. Mrs. Hayes has demonstrated a pattern of harassment directed at our family, and I believe her continued interference constitutes a form of persecution that should be legally addressed." I appreciated Tom's immediate defense of my character, but I also knew that we would need more than righteous indignation to counter Mrs. Hayes's latest attack. This time, she had apparently gathered actual statements from people who had known me during my mill years, which gave her accusations a credibility they had previously lacked. "What kind of witness statements?" I asked, dreading the answer, but needing to understand what we were facing. Judge Carter consulted his papers reluctantly. "She claims to have affidavits from former mill workers describing episodes of what they characterize as erratic behavior, emotional instability, and inability to cope with normal workplace stresses. The allegations suggest that you suffered some kind of breakdown during your employment that left you psychologically impaired." The cruelty of the accusation took my breath away. Mrs. Hayes was taking the normal human responses to intolerable working conditions, exhaustion, frustration, occasional tears, and recasting them as evidence of mental instability. She was using my humanity against me, suggesting that showing emotion under stress was proof of unfitness for motherhood. But as the initial shock wore off, I felt something else rising in its place, a calm, steady anger that clarified my thinking rather than clouding it. Mrs. Hayes had underestimated both my resilience and the strength of the community support we had built over the past 4 years. "Judge Carter," I said quietly, "I would like to request a formal hearing where these allegations can be examined properly. I believe that when the full context of my mill experience is presented, along with evidence of my current character and capabilities, these charges will be revealed as the malicious fabrications they are." Tom looked at me with surprise and pride. "Are you sure you want to put yourself through that kind of scrutiny again, Kate?" I thought about Hope, playing contentedly in the next room, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected. I thought about the life we had built together, the community that had come to accept and support us, the proof of my capabilities that existed in every aspect of our household and business management. "I'm sure," I said firmly, "Mrs. Hayes is counting on me being too afraid or ashamed to defend myself publicly. But I'm not the broken mill girl she remembers. I'm a successful wife, mother, and businesswoman, and I have 4 years of evidence to prove it." The formal hearing was scheduled for early January, giving us several weeks to prepare our defense. Tom immediately began gathering character witnesses and documentation of our family's stability and success. Dr. Walsh agreed to testify about Hope's excellent health and development, while Pastor Morrison offered to speak about our contributions to community life. But the most powerful support came from an unexpected source. Maria Rodriguez approached me one evening with a proposal that demonstrated the depth of friendship that had developed between us. "Kate," she said, "I have been thinking about Mrs. Hayes and her accusations. I worked in textile mills myself before I married Frank, in different places but under similar conditions. I know what that life does to people, and I know the difference between normal human responses to cruelty and actual mental instability." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "If it would help, I am willing to testify about my own mill experiences and about what I have observed of your character and capabilities since we became neighbors. Mrs. Hayes is not the only one who understands what mill life was like." Maria's offer moved me deeply because I knew she was a private person who rarely shared details about her past. Her willingness to expose her own difficult experiences in order to defend me demonstrated a loyalty and friendship that I had never expected to receive from anyone. As we prepared for the hearing, I found myself reflecting on how much I had changed since that frightened girl had stood in Judge Carter's courthouse 4 years earlier. The mill had been a place of suffering, but it had also taught me lessons about endurance, adaptation, and the importance of holding on to hope, even in the darkest circumstances. Mrs. Hayes was trying to use my past against me, but she had fundamentally misunderstood both what that past represented and who I had become since leaving it behind. The experiences that she characterized as evidence of instability were actually proof of my strength, my ability to survive and ultimately thrive despite conditions designed to break my spirit. The night before the hearing, Tom and I sat together in our parlor after Hope had been put to bed. The familiar room felt especially precious that evening, filled with the accumulated memories of 4 years of family life. Hope's toys were scattered across the floor, evidence of a day filled with play and laughter. The walls held photographs that documented our growth as a family, and the bookshelves showed signs of constant use by people who valued learning and thoughtful conversation. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Tom said, "I want you to know how proud I am of who you've become. The woman sitting beside me tonight is nothing like the frightened girl I brought home from that courthouse. You've grown into someone remarkable, someone any parent would be fortunate to have as a role model for their child." His words helped calm the nervousness that had been building as the hearing approached. "I keep thinking about what you said that first day, about maybe we could help each other. I don't think either of us understood how true that would turn out to be. Tom smiled, reaching over to take my hand. The best partnerships are the ones where both people become more than they could have been alone. That's what we've built together, Kate. We've made each other stronger. The hearing the next day was held in the same courthouse where my life had changed direction 4 years earlier, but I entered it as a completely different person. Instead of the worn brown dress and frightened demeanor of the mill girl, I wore a blue dress I had sewn myself from fabric, purchased with my market earnings. My hair was arranged neatly, my posture confident, and my voice steady as I answered questions about my background and current circumstances. Mrs. Hayes had indeed gathered statements from former mill workers, but when these testimonies were examined closely, they revealed more about the horrific working conditions at the mill than about any personal failings on my part. The erratic behavior they described included crying after particularly brutal treatment from supervisors, showing exhaustion after working 18-hour shifts, and occasionally speaking up when witnessing cruelty to other workers. Maria Rodriguez's testimony proved devastating to Mrs. Hayes's case. Speaking with quiet authority, Maria described the systematic dehumanization that characterized mill employment, the way workers were deliberately isolated and brutalized to maintain control. She explained how normal human responses to such treatment were often mischaracterized as mental instability by supervisors who needed to justify their cruelty. What Mrs. Hayes calls evidence of Kate's unfitness, Maria stated clearly, I recognize as proof of her humanity. The fact that she maintained her capacity for compassion and hope despite years of deliberate mistreatment demonstrates exceptional strength of character, not weakness. Dr. Walsh's testimony about Hope's development provided concrete evidence of my capabilities as a mother. He presented detailed records showing that Hope exceeded developmental milestones consistently, that she showed every sign of secure attachment and emotional health, and that her physical well-being reflected excellent care and nutrition. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Pastor Morrison spoke about the transformation he had witnessed in our family over the past 4 years. He described the way we had grown from a collection of wounded individuals into a cohesive unit that strengthened both ourselves and our community. Your Honor, Pastor Morrison concluded, I have presided over hundreds of weddings and baptisms in my career, and I have observed many different types of families. I can state without reservation that the Mitchell family represents everything. That family life should be based on love, mutual support, shared values, and commitment to each other's welfare. Any attempt to disrupt this family would be a tragedy, not just for them, but for our entire community. When I was called to testify on my own behalf, I spoke about the journey that had brought me from mill worker to ranch wife and mother. I described the skills I had developed, the contributions I made to our household and community, and the love that motivated every aspect of my care for Hope. Mrs. Hayes suggests that my mill experience left me unfit for family life, I said, looking directly at the judge. But I would argue the opposite. My time at the mill taught me to value safety, kindness, and genuine care because I had experienced their absence. It taught me never to take love for granted because I had lived without it. Most importantly, it taught me that everyone deserves dignity and respect, lessons I try to pass on to my daughter every day. The judge's decision was swift and unequivocal. After less than an hour of deliberation, he ruled that Mrs. Hayes's allegations were unfounded and that any future harassment of our family would result in legal consequences for her. He praised the evidence of our family's stability and success, and he explicitly stated that Hope was clearly thriving under our care. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt a profound sense of closure, Mrs. Hayes's attempts to use my past against me had failed because I had refused to be ashamed of experiences that had ultimately made me stronger. The frightened mill girl, who had once stood in that same building, had been replaced by a confident woman who knew her own worth and could defend it effectively. Hope was waiting for us at home with Maria, playing with her dolls and chattering about the snow that had begun falling while we were in town. When she saw us return, she ran to greet us with the unself-conscious joy that characterized all her interactions with people she loved. "Mama Kate, Papa Tom," she called, throwing her arms around both of us. "Maria taught me a new song while you were gone. Do you want to hear it?" Looking down at her bright, trusting face, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought us all together. The mill girl, who had once believed herself broken and worthless, had become the mother of this confident, joyful child. The man who had thought himself condemned to lifelong loneliness had found a partner who shared his dreams and values. That evening, as we gathered for our usual story time, I chose a book I had never read to Hope before. It was the story of a caterpillar who had to dissolve completely before emerging as a butterfly. A transformation that seemed impossible from the outside, but was actually the natural fulfillment of the caterpillar's deepest potential. Why does the caterpillar have to get all gooey before it becomes a butterfly? Hope asked, studying the illustrations with intense interest. Sometimes things have to change completely before they can become what they're really meant to be. I explained, thinking about my own transformation from mill worker to mother. The caterpillar doesn't know it's going to be a butterfly when it spins its cocoon. It just knows it needs to change. Hope nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her. Like how you didn't know you were going to be my mama when you lived at the scary place. Her innocent question made my throat tight with emotion. Exactly like that, sweetheart. Sometimes the best things in life happen in ways we never could have planned or expected. As I tucked Hope into bed that night, she looked up at me with serious eyes. "Mama Kate, am I going to change into something different when I grow up?" I smoothed her hair back from her forehead, thinking about all the possibilities that lay ahead for this remarkable child. "You're going to change and grow, but the most important part of you, the part that makes you Hope, will always stay the same. You'll always be brave and curious and kind, no matter what else happens." She smiled, satisfied with this answer, and closed her eyes trustingly. "I love you, Mama Kate. I love you too, Hope. More than all the stars in the sky." Later that night, as Tom and I prepared for bed, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed since that day when $50 had changed hands in Judge Carter's office. The transaction that had freed me from the mill had seemed like a simple business arrangement at the time, but it had actually been the first step in a journey that would reshape every aspect of my existence. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Judge Carter had found someone else to take over my mill debt? I asked Tom as we settled into bed. Tom was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I try not to think about alternate histories. What actually happened was perfect. Even when it was difficult, we found each other at exactly the moment when we could help each other heal and grow. I nestled closer to him, listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling into nighttime. Quiet. Somewhere down the hall, Hope sighed in her sleep, and I could hear Maria and Frank moving around in their own cottage, completing their evening routines. "I'm grateful for all of it," I said softly. "Even the hard parts, even Mrs. Hayes and her cruelty. Everything that happened led us to this moment, to this family, to this life we've built together." Tom's arms tightened around me. The mill girl who started this journey was already remarkable. She just needed the right circumstances to let her strength show. I'm honored that I got to witness her transformation into the woman I married. As I drifted towards sleep, I thought about the story I had read to Hope about the caterpillars. Metamorphosis. My own transformation had been less dramatic, but no less complete. The frightened, damaged girl who had left the mill had indeed dissolved in many ways, but what had emerged was stronger and more beautiful than anything I could have imagined during those dark years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but tonight we were complete. The family that had begun with a desperate rancher's need for help and a mill girl's hunger for safety had grown into something that blessed everyone it touched. Hope would grow up knowing that love could triumph over circumstance, that families could be chosen as well as inherited, and that every person possessed the potential for transformation if given the right combination of love, support, and opportunity. The snow continued to fall outside our windows, blanketing the valley in pristine white that would nourish the earth when spring returned. Inside our warm house, 3 people who had found each other against all odds slept peacefully, secure. In the knowledge that they belonged exactly where they were, the circle was complete. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.